In this seminar video, we are going to look at differences in transportation and society between the northern United States and the southern US in the mid-1800s. So we'll start with transportation in the north. One of the big differences between transportation in the north and the south is that the transportation in the north was just better developed. They had better roads. There was a national road. It was the first road that was funded by Congress. They also had many more miles of railroad track, more than 20,000 miles. And the North was home to many fast ships and canals. There were steamboats that would take people up and down the Mississippi River and through other waterways as well. The Erie Canal connected the state of New York to the Midwest, and today you can actually get all the way from the city of Duluth, Minnesota, out to the Atlantic Ocean through the St. Lawrence Seaway. And a lot of that was already being connected at this time. So if you lived in the north, you had many more transportation options, and the things that were available to you were better developed. You could travel further and faster as a result. Transportation in the south was less developed. There weren't as many big roads. The primary source of transportation in the south was actually rivers. It was relatively safe and easy and inexpensive to travel by boat along the rivers. I mentioned already those steamboats that would take people up and down the Mississippi, among other rivers. And so it was common that cities would grow along those rivers just because there was such easy access. You could bring building materials, and people could move to the cities by traveling by boat along the river. Like I mentioned on the previous slide, the South had only 10,000 miles of railroad track compared to more than 20,000 miles in the North. So railroads at this time were a newer development. They allowed for faster transportation, but with so many fewer miles of track, that was much more limited in the South. Then when we compare society in the North and the South, society in the South, like we've already talked about a lot with the economy, was based largely on the haves, the plantation owners who were typically wealthy and white, and the have-nots. Typically, it was African American enslaved individuals that did most of the labor on the plantations. So wealth was displayed by the amount of land that you owned and the number of slaves that you owned. There was a very rigid social structure. That means that there weren't a lot of opportunities for changes in your social status. At the top of the social structure were the plantation owners. They had the most money, they had the most land and prestige. They would have controlled most of the businesses and the banks and politics in the South. Second under them were white farmers. These were poor individuals who might have had a smaller farm and maybe grew enough for their family and a little bit extra to sell, but they didn't own a giant plantation with hundreds or thousands of acres. And they did most of the work themselves. They didn't have any enslaved individuals who were working for them. At the bottom of the social structure were those African American enslaved individuals. They were not permitted to own land. They weren't paid for their labor. Their owner or master would give them the basic necessities, 1 or 2 outfits, 1 or 2 blankets for the year, basic food, but they weren't given much more than that, and they certainly didn't have anything that would be considered a want. The white Southerners I mentioned before were the plantation owners, and they would entertain themselves by hosting big parties and go and visit people socially. They didn't need to work on their plantations because they had enslaved individuals to do that for them. So they were free to spend their time socially. Their sons went to college to get a college degree and then would grow up to inherit the plantation or buy their own. Their daughters were brought up to be wives. So they were taught how to run a household, how to present everything in their home for entertaining. White farmers owned the land, but they didn't have slaves, like I mentioned. And then if there were African Americans who were not enslaved, they typically lived in cities. Almost all African Americans living in the South at this time were enslaved, and they worked in fields on cotton or sugar or tobacco plantations. Society in the North was quite a bit different. While most Northerners still lived on farms and farming was the way they made their living. Cities were growing rapidly during the Industrial Revolution. More and more immigrants were moving into cities and taking low-paying jobs in factories, in mills, and so cities needed places to house them, and they just exploded as more and more factories and mills were able to do more work with the invention of things like the cotton gin and some of the things we've talked about in this chapter. Cities were not especially glamorous. Most of them lacked sewers and paved streets. So as you can imagine, those rutted dirt roads and sewage just dumped out of windows made for some pretty gross living conditions. There were a fair number of African Americans living in northern cities at this time. They were not enslaved, but they were certainly not treated equally. They couldn't vote. They had separate jobs, separate churches that they started forming at this time, typically lived in separate neighborhoods, and even though they weren't enslaved, they would have had lower jobs within the city, jobs that other people didn't want, weren't willing to do. They were fairly low paying, and a lot of their living was day-to-day subsistence. Immigrants were moving into American cities in the North in big numbers. We've already talked about that in this chapter. During the time period we're studying, more than 4 million immigrants, mostly from Germany and Ireland, arrived in northern cities. This was because of a few things, but most predominantly it was caused by the potato famine in Ireland. We studied this in chapter 18, and we looked at some primary sources. The potato famine caused more than half of the potato crop to die in Ireland very quickly, and potatoes were a significant part of what fed the Irish. And so they were short on food, and Ireland's population decreased by 50% in a very short period of time due to starvation and people fleeing Ireland because they were hungry and they wanted a better life elsewhere. So immigrants, mostly German and Irish, but not entirely, settled in cities. They worked in factories. They took those low-paying jobs that we've learned about in this chapter. Irish immigrants were not treated very well because, among other things, they were Roman Catholic. While most people living in the United States at this time would have been considered Protestant, Americans were nervous that the Irish would take their jobs, that they would bring violence and crime and other things, and so they did not treat the Irish very well. German immigrants tended to be more middle class. When they arrived, they had more money. They weren't factory workers, commonly the way the Irish were at this time, and so they had more middle class status. So that's it for notes on chapter 18, examining differences between North and South.